Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nancy Coleman. I'm Dean of Harvard's Division of Continuing Education and University Extension. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to what we think is an incredible segment, a little bit on the history of the Harvard Extension School. So I'm here with Harvard lecturer Zachary Nowak, who is going to share a bit about our storied history of both Harvard and the Extension School and trace a little bit of our legacy. So you get a bigger sense of who we are and how we fit into the ecosystem of Harvard. So I'll just begin with a couple of really fast facts. And that's that the origin of the Harvard Extension School can be traced all the way back to 1835, when American philanthropist and business person John Lowell Jr. founded the Lowell Institute. In his will, Lowell founded an organization that was designed to provide Boston with a series of free public lectures on a variety of subjects. The Institute really quickly gained an influential presence. And in 1910, Lowell founded the Commission on Extension Courses, which was an organization designed to provide free courses to the citizenry of Boston, including women and men, and provide a popular education to folks who couldn't necessarily come to college full-time and during the day. So we're really proud of that history, and with well over 100 years of legacy, we look forward to the future. So let me now introduce you to Professor Nowak. Zach, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Coleman. I appreciate it. I'm Zach Nowak. I got my PhD in American Studies from Harvard in 2018. I've taught both in Harvard College and in Harvard Extension. And I'm mainly an environmental and food historian, but I also focus on 19th century US history. And we're not supposed to have favorite classes, but my favorite class to teach in Extension is a class about the history of Harvard and also Radcliffe colleges. And this class, in a way, is a little bit of a bait and switch, in the sense that it's definitely about the history of Harvard and the history of Radcliffe, but it's also a historical methods class. I just knew no one would take a class called Historical Methods 101. And the class is also a how to do college. It's really like a lot of classes in the Extension School, not just a whole bunch of content, but also strategies on how to read an academic journal article quicker and better, how to write with less stress, and how to do research. That's a real core of my class, and I know other Extension classes as well.
Yeah, and Zach, I'm so lucky in that I got a chance to experience your course firsthand. And the story of that is that I became dean of DCE in the summer of 2020 at a time right in the middle of the pandemic. And fall 2021, I decided I wanted to take a class. I wanted to take a class at Harvard. So I started looking at our incredible catalog of courses, and there's so many to choose from. But the history of Harvard, your class really stood out to me, because I thought, what better way to really understand what Harvard is like, and what the Extension School is like, than taking a history class. So that was my first class at the Extension School, and I really enjoyed it.
I have to say, I'm honored by that 100%, and it was wonderful to have you in the class. But your email in August of last year caught me off guard. I first thought it was an email. I thought it was just an email from the dean of Harvard Division of Continuing Education to all of the people who teach. And so I look at it, Dear Zachary Nowak, and I'm reading. And then I realized it was an email from you to me. I looked at the bottom, wait, when? This is Nancy Coleman wrote me an email about attending my class. And I have to confess that it caused about 30 seconds of absolute panic. Because I thought, man, that's really intimidating to have the ultimate boss, the ultimate dean be in the class. And yet I think it was, first of all, it was wonderful to have you in the class to learn about Harvard history, but also contribute to that. And the class, I think, is not only about Harvard College and Radcliffe College, but also how Extension fits into that, and how Extension is not just some minor part of the larger Harvard story, but actually a really important cutting edge part of Harvard's story.
Absolutely. And what I loved most about the class is it's it's the people's history of Harvard, right? So you really focus on the people behind the scenes, some of the underserved populations, telling those backstories that we don't often hear. And that for me just layered in a level of authenticity about the experience that I don't think that you get from reading a book and really witnessing it firsthand. So I thank you for that. And we'd love to hear a little bit about some of the things that you cover in that course or some of the highlights for you.
Sure, absolutely. There are a lot of different ways to tell Harvard's history, and I'm not the first person to attempt that. Some people have sort of focused on the presidents of Harvard and what happens under each of their administrations. Other people looked at the religious history. There are books about the architectural history, but my class is really about, like you said, the social history. People that are not necessarily the presidents or even the faculty, but often the students who are a really central part of Harvard's history, and support staff. So the janitors and the people who are on the cleaning staff and other people that are all affiliated with Harvard in some way. And I think one of the greatest discoveries that I made doing the research for this class is that almost no matter what you look like or who you are or how you identify, people like you have always been involved in Harvard, almost since the beginning, no matter what. And people like you may not have always been students. Now Harvard has, especially Extension, has a much more broader student body than 200 years ago. But people like you have always been involved in some way. And so I'm just going to pull out a couple anecdotes about early Harvard history, but then I do really want to talk, now I call you Nancy. Nancy, since we got to know each other in the class, I do, if you want to talk about the specifics to at least the 20th century history of Extension, if that's okay.
Yes, I'd love that.
Okay, so first of all, one thing that I was astonished to find out is that Harvard started as a public school. Harvard wasn't founded by John Harvard. Harvard was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony and was supported by that colony for almost 200 years. John Harvard gave a crucial early bequest. He gave some money and he gave a whole bunch of books to the library. But the original name of Harvard College was New College. Students, especially in the 1600s, but even into the early 1800s, students, when they came as first-year students, were often 13 and 14-year-old boys. They really were quite young. And so a lot of the great disciplinary problems that we read about in the archives, there's extensive archival documents about punishments, as you can imagine, from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And when you look at those documents and you think about the fact that boys were 13 and 14, they were really just boys who were cooped up inside Harvard Yard with very strict professors and boring classes, you can understand why they were mischievous. Harvard rooms were heated by fireplaces. The students had to pay for their own wood, and they often would heat up cannonballs, old cannonballs from the Revolutionary War, to a red hot color, and then put them on stands around the room. It's amazing actually that more Harvard buildings did not burn down. Another thing that I found really interesting is that the very first intercollegiate sporting event ever in the United States happened in August of 1852. And the two schools were Harvard and Yale, and the sport was rowing. And do you know who won? Well, of course, you know who won, Nancy.
I do.
Harvard, of course. But there are also really cool progressive parts of Harvard's story that I enjoy telling in this class. And one of them is the Cuban Summer School. The United States invades Cuba as part of what's called the Spanish-American War. Invades Cuba in 1898 and basically takes over the island and essentially annexes it. And the head of the new administration, the public school administration, is a Harvard graduate. He comes up with this idea to bring almost all of the Cuban public school teachers to Harvard for summer school classes in 1900. And this happens, but the great thing about it is it's mostly donations for people living in Boston, not just rich people, but even people of modest means. And all of the Cuban teachers have a little red tag with a number. And so everyone in Boston knows if you see someone who looks confused, who has a little red tag, you have to help them. And Harvard students are also asked if they will give their rooms and their beds and to these Cuban students and let them use their sheets. And overwhelmingly, in an era where Harvard students were quite elite young men, overwhelmingly they say yes, which I think is it's a high point of relationships with the Latin American world that Harvard doesn't get back to for a long time. And finally, for the more Harvard specific and Radcliffe specific history, the Students for the Democratic Society, the SDS chapter at Harvard and Radcliffe, was the biggest chapter in the country in the 1960s, which I think is kind of neat. And I'll pass it back to you for a minute, Nancy.
So tell us a little bit about extension, Zach. I know you mentioned that it's going to be a subject of a focus area coming up in one of your classes over the next couple of years. What are some of the highlights for you when you think about the history of the extension school here?
So what is missing? I'm going to talk about what's missing from extension's history first. What's missing is the voices of the students. There are a lot of records in the archives of Harvard about extension's administrative history, its leadership, but not yet its social history. Who were the students? Why did they decide to study? What did they get out of it? That's going to be a focus, I think, of your writing in the future. And I'm hoping myself to be able to provide some of the primary sources for that research through the class the next time it runs. But extension and more broadly, the Division of Continuing Education is not just some little part of Harvard over at the margins. Extension and DCE, what is now DCE, have actually always been on very much at the forefront of the vanguard of Harvard as far as inclusivity and also technology. And this is a story that I discovered when I was preparing this version for extension of the class. So I want to tell a little bit about that. First of all, let's talk about inclusivity. Harvard starts offering some lectures through the Lowell Institute in the middle of the 1800s, and then also some summer school classes. Whereas Harvard at that point was only for men. And in fact, until 1942, it's only for men. Already in the 1860s, summer school is open to women. And the Harvard administrators are shocked at how many women enroll in the classes, and not classes that have literary themes as they would have expected, but science classes. And so already the summer school part of DCE is way ahead of the rest of Harvard by almost 100 years as far as gender inclusivity, which I think is a really cool part of the story. But then another part of the story that I think is awesome is the technological part. And that is, if you look at how extension starts doing distance learning and extension don't start at Harvard. There is a bigger movement at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century to try to have universities go beyond their walls, go beyond their yards and their gates like those at Harvard, and try to include more people in that process. And Harvard is definitely looking to do that early on, but it's really after the 1950s that the technology is there too, because previously there had been correspondence classes, but you'd also either been limited to just text through correspondence or people who could physically come to campus in the evenings for classes. But this changes in 1949. In 1949, WGBH radio starts in Boston. And this radio is underwritten by the Lowell Institute, which you talked about before, Nancy. This really core part of extension starts the first radio in Boston. And immediately, one of the very first things that they're broadcasting is extension classes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then TV follows. WGBH follows with TV in 1951, and it's the same thing. One of the most popular things on the radio and the TV in Boston are extension classes from Harvard. Hundreds and hundreds, and eventually thousands of students are taking these classes in the evenings, certain days of the week. In the 1960s, Harvard starts the Deer Island Prison program. So extension says, okay, we're also going to bring education to people who are incarcerated. And using television, extension goes into the prisons off the coast of Harvard, or off the coast of Boston. This is so popular and so successful that extension says, well, we can beam TV anywhere. And so the US Navy and extension work together to provide classes for sailors on nuclear submarines in the US Navy. Fast forward 1984, some of the people that are listening can probably conjure up in their minds the sound of what a modem sounded like back in the 1980s and 90s. I know I can. Harvard Extension starts using the voice data modem in 1984. All of a sudden, that reach is even larger. In 2000, online courses start. And by 2001, just a year later, there are 25 courses with 2,200 students enrolled. iTunes is next, 2005, Harvard X 2007. So this is all really neat, and it's extension at the vanguard technologically. But for me, I don't want to say the best part of the story, but a great part of the story is in March 2020, Harvard College closes its doors and sends students home. And all of a sudden, Harvard College has to do distance learning. And Harvard College comes to Harvard Extension to figure out how to do that. And so Extension, again, it's not some marginal part of Harvard at the edges. It is at the absolute forefront technologically and allows Harvard College to continue, which is, again, one of my favorite parts of this story, but a symbol of how Extension is central to the history of Harvard.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Zach. We're really proud of everything that we have done to foster inclusive, open education in Boston and beyond. Now, from our humble roots in the Boston-Cambridge area, we're now really a global institution. We serve students from every state in the US and over 126 countries globally. So we are really focusing on right now, really building that global community of learners, and how do we support them so that they can feel just as connected via distance learning or whatever their experience is as someone who could walk up to a classroom here in Cambridge. So and your class sort of helps us make connections and all of that, and really helps that take us to the next level. So I just want to thank you for your time today and telling us the story of your class. Kind of wish there was a Harvard history part 2 that I could take. And I've got to figure out what my next class is going to be so I can really build on that incredible knowledge. And we're just so grateful that we have incredible thought leaders like you teaching our courses at the Extension School and in DCE and at this institution. So thanks for being here today.
Sure. And just two last notes, one historical and one not. One is a reiteration of what I said before. No matter who you are or how you identify, there have almost certainly been people like you involved with Harvard since the beginning of Harvard's history. And in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, thanks to Extension, also as students at Harvard. So don't think like, oh, I don't fit into this category or that category, I can't go to Harvard. Yeah, you can. And I would say something else. I think sometimes Extension students think, oh, well, I didn't go to a fancy undergrad, or I didn't go to a fancy high school, or this and that. Extension students, in my experience, have an enormous advantage over 19-year-olds, no matter where those 19-year-olds went to high school, because all of you have practical life experience. And you would be amazed at how valuable that is in a classroom. And so I think that I want to encourage everybody to think, I'm not the first person like me to go to Extension. And also, I bring all kinds of tools in my toolkit that I can use to build with for research and for writing when I do Extension classes.
Absolutely. So well said, Zach. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So thanks again for being here today, and look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you for the invitation.